The gates of Harrison Estate hadn't opened in 3 years. Now they stood wide, and Damien Harrison walked through them like a man returning to a grave he wasn't ready to visit. 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw permanently set and a black tattoo curling up the side of his neck, Damien carried himself the way men do when they've spent a decade making sure nobody ever sees them flinch. His grandfather had built an empire out of loyalty and silence. Damien had inherited both, along with the mansion, the money, and a weight in his chest he hadn't expected. He hadn't planned on coming back so soon, but the lawyers said the estate needed him, and some stubborn part of him wanted to see the house one more time before he decided what to do with it. He didn't expect to find a mystery waiting behind the library door. It was tucked on the third shelf, wedged between 2 leather-bound ledgers nobody had touched in years. A cookbook. Worn at the edges, its spine cracked from being opened and closed 1,000 times. Damien almost passed over it. Then he saw his grandfather's handwriting on the inside cover, small and rushed, like it had been written in a hurry. "Protect this. Trust no one who asks about it directly." That single line changed everything. Damien flipped through page after page of recipes that made no sense in the order they appeared. Soup, followed by dessert, followed by a bread recipe, followed by something that looked like a half-finished stew. No dates, no categories, no pattern he could see. But his grandfather never did anything without a reason, and if the old man had hidden a warning inside a cookbook, then the cookbook was hiding something bigger. Within a week, Damien had hired 99 of the sharpest minds money could buy. Cryptographers who'd cracked wartime codes, historians who specialized in early 20th century Chicago, puzzle designers who built escape rooms for a living, language experts who checked for hidden ciphers in the recipe names. He gave them each a copy of the pages and told them to find what his grandfather had buried. 99 brilliant people spent 2 weeks failing. They built theories about numerology. They mapped ingredient counts against calendar dates. One historian was convinced the recipes referenced old Prohibition-era delivery routes. Another expert insisted the answer was hidden in a mirrored version of the text and spent 4 days reading it backward before giving up entirely. Every theory collapsed under its own weight. The cookbook sat on the long table in the estate's dining room, taunting all of them. Damien watched his money disappear into dead ends and his patience disappear right along with it. Meanwhile, life at the estate carried on in its quiet way, mostly thanks to Chloe Brooks. Chloe had worked at Harrison Estate for almost 3 years, ever since Damien's grandfather hired her personally after she helped him find a missing box of medical records nobody else could locate. She was 26, warm-eyed, plus-size, with dark curls she usually pinned back before starting her shift, and a laugh that carried through the hallways whenever something amused her. She didn't scare easily, and she definitely wasn't intimidated by the parade of experts marching through the house with laptops and folders and superior opinions about a cookbook they clearly didn't understand. She'd overheard enough of their conversations to know they were stuck. She also knew something they didn't. She'd spent 3 years dusting every shelf, wiping every counter, and memorizing every inch of that kitchen, because attention to detail was simply how she worked. She didn't think in ciphers or historical timelines. She thought in rooms, in layouts, in how a kitchen actually functioned when someone was standing in it, moving from counter to stove to pantry 100 times a day. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while the experts argued over lunch about whether the recipes followed a mathematical sequence, Chloe wandered into the dining room to collect empty coffee cups. She caught sight of the cookbook lying open on the table, and something about the recipe order caught her attention. She picked it up without really meaning to. Soup, bread, dessert, stew, soup again. She frowned, flipping back a page, then forward again. It wasn't random. It wasn't a code either, not really. It was something far simpler and far more familiar to her than to any of the specialists who'd been staring at it for 2 weeks. It was a walking path. The soup recipe sat where the stove would be. The bread recipe matched the counter where dough would be kneaded. The dessert page lined up with where a cooling rack might sit near a window. Chloe had cleaned enough old kitchens to recognize the shape of one, even a kitchen that no longer existed in this exact form. The original layout of Harrison Estate's kitchen, the one from Damien's grandfather's time, had been redesigned twice over the decades. But she'd seen old photographs in the hallway. She knew where the original pantry used to be. She grabbed a pencil, sketched a rough outline of the old kitchen on the back of a napkin, and matched each recipe to a section of the room. When she reached the final page, her sketch pointed to one exact spot, beneath the pantry floor. Damien walked in just as she straightened up, cookbook in one hand, napkin in the other, looking far too calm for someone who had just solved what 99 professionals couldn't. "You're going to want to see this," she said simply. He looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Then he looked at the napkin. Then, slowly, understanding crossed his face, and something shifted behind his eyes, disbelief mixing with the first real spark of hope he'd felt since opening that library door. "You figured this out with a pencil and a napkin," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Chloe shrugged, unbothered. "I clean this house every day. I know it better than anyone who's only seen it on paper." Damien stared at her a moment longer, then set the folders of expert reports aside without another glance. "Show me," he said. They walked toward the pantry together, and neither of them noticed the man watching quietly from the hallway, a man who had spent decades making sure this particular secret stayed buried. The pantry hadn't been touched in years, not really. Cans were restocked, shelves were wiped down, but nobody had ever thought to look underneath it. Chloe knelt on the tile floor, running her fingers along the wooden baseboard, while Damien stood over her with his arms crossed, still processing what had just happened in the dining room. 2 weeks of hired experts, and his own housekeeper had cracked it with a napkin sketch and a memory of old photographs. "Here," Chloe said, tapping a spot where the boards met at a slightly uneven seam. "This doesn't match the rest of the flooring. Look at the grain." Damien crouched beside her. She was right. The wood there ran a different direction than the planks around it, like it had been cut and replaced at some point, then aged just enough to blend in. He pressed down on one edge, and the board shifted under his palm. "Get me something to pry this up," he said. Chloe returned a minute later with a flathead screwdriver from the utility drawer, the kind used for tightening cabinet hinges, not excavating family secrets. Damien worked it into the seam and pushed. The board resisted, then gave way with a low groan, revealing a shallow compartment built into the floor joists beneath the pantry. Inside sat 3 things: a leather notebook, its cover soft and cracked with age, an antique brass key, heavier than it looked, with a design etched into the head that neither of them recognized, and a photograph, slightly yellowed, showing a much younger version of Damien's grandfather, standing with 3 other men, all of them smiling, in front of a building none of them could place at first glance. Damien lifted the photograph first, studying the faces. "I don't know 2 of these men," he admitted, "but that's Richard. Richard Collins. He's been with the family since before I was born." Chloe leaned in for a closer look. The man beside Damien's grandfather was younger, thinner, but unmistakably the same advisor who still worked closely with the family decades later. Loyal, careful, always present at important meetings but rarely the center of attention. She'd served him coffee 100 times over the years and never thought twice about him. Damien set the photograph aside and opened the notebook. The handwriting inside matched the note in the cookbook, small and deliberate, written by a man who chose his words carefully because he expected someone else to eventually read them. The first page was dated over 40 years earlier. "If you found this, you've already proven yourself capable of more than the people I hired to look for it. Good. This is only the beginning. What I've protected cannot be found in one place, because a single discovery can be stolen, destroyed, or twisted into a lie. I built a trail instead. Follow it carefully and trust the people who've earned it, not the people who claim it." Damien read the passage twice, then read it a 3rd time out loud so Chloe could hear it properly. "He was protecting something," she said quietly. "Not hiding treasure. Protecting it." "There's a difference," Damien murmured, more to himself than to her. He flipped through the remaining pages, but most of them were blank, waiting to be filled with whatever clue came next. Only the final page held anything useful, a short paragraph referencing a bakery in Milwaukee, along with a name Damien didn't recognize. He made a mental note to ask his security chief to run a background check before they went anywhere. They stayed in the pantry a while longer, sorting through what little else the compartment held. Nothing but dust and a faint smell of old wood. Damien finally stood, offering Chloe a hand to help her up, which she accepted with a small, surprised smile, like she hadn't expected the gesture from him. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. The cookbook, this. None of my experts would have found any of this in a year, let alone an afternoon." "I just pay attention," Chloe said. "It's not complicated." "It clearly is, since 99 people missed it." She laughed at that, and for a moment the heaviness in the room eased. Then Damien's phone buzzed. A message from his head of estate security, a man named Frank who'd worked for the family even longer than Richard had. Basement storage disturbed. 2 boxes moved. Nothing missing, but someone was down there recently. Damien read the message twice before showing it to Chloe. Her smile faded. "Someone's already looking," she said. "Or someone never stopped looking," Damien replied grimly. They made their way to the basement together, past the wine cellar and into the older section of storage, where decades of family belongings sat gathering dust in labeled crates. Frank was already there, flashlight in hand, examining a set of boxes near the far wall. "Nothing's gone," Frank confirmed as they approached, "but these 2 boxes were definitely shifted. Dust patterns don't lie. Someone came through here in the last week, maybe less." "Cameras?" Damien asked. "None down here. Your grandfather never wanted surveillance near the storage rooms, said it made the staff uncomfortable." Damien exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. First the cookbook, now this. Whatever his grandfather had buried wasn't just old history collecting dust. Someone out there still cared enough to search for it, quietly, carefully, without leaving obvious tracks. "I want extra security on the estate," Damien said. "Nothing dramatic, no announcements, just eyes where there weren't eyes before." Frank nodded and headed off to make the arrangements. Damien turned to Chloe, who stood near the boxes with her arms wrapped around herself, the earlier warmth in her expression replaced by something more careful. "You don't have to keep helping with this," Damien said. "If things get complicated, I'd understand." Chloe considered that for a moment, then shook her head. "Your grandfather protected something that mattered enough to build a trail nobody else could follow. I want to know what it was. And honestly," she added, a faint smile returning, "your experts had 2 weeks and got nowhere. Somebody competent needs to stay on this." Damien almost laughed, despite the tension still sitting in his chest. He glanced once more at the disturbed boxes, then back at Chloe. "Milwaukee," he said. "Tomorrow morning. There's a bakery we need to find." The drive to Milwaukee took just under 2 hours, most of it spent in comfortable silence, except for Chloe reading pieces of the leather notebook out loud, trying to make sense of the sparse clues Damien's grandfather had left behind. The bakery sat on a quiet corner in an older part of the city, the kind of block where half the storefronts had been converted into something else years ago, and the other half simply stood empty. A faded sign above the door still read Petrov's Bakery, the letters chipped and sun-bleached, though the building had clearly been closed for a long time. Damien's grandfather's notebook mentioned the name once, tied to a man called Anton Petrov, one of the 3 men standing beside him in the old photograph from the pantry. "He owned this place?" Chloe asked, stepping out of the car and studying the boarded windows. "According to the notebook, they were close for decades," Damien said. "Business partners, then just friends. Petrov passed away years ago. The building's been sitting empty ever since." Getting inside wasn't difficult. Damien had made a call ahead, and the property manager, an older man who barely asked questions once he saw the Harrison name, unlocked the door and left them to look around on their own. The inside smelled like dust and old flour, faint but unmistakable even after all these years. Wooden counters lined one wall, most of the equipment long since removed, but a few original fixtures remained. An oven too heavy to bother hauling out, a prep table scarred with decades of knife marks, and near the back wall, a large wooden bread rack, tall and sturdy, clearly built to hold dozens of trays back when the bakery was still running. Damien had brought along 2 consultants for this leg of the search, a historian and a locksmith, both part of his original team of 99. They immediately gravitated toward the walls, searching for hidden safes or false panels, tapping surfaces and checking for hollow sounds behind the plaster. Chloe drifted toward the bread rack instead. Something about it bothered her, though she couldn't immediately explain why. It wasn't the design, it was the wear pattern. The wooden legs showed scuff marks in a very specific place, low near the base, the kind of marks that came from repeated contact over years, not from being bumped occasionally by passing carts. "This rack's been moved constantly," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Like someone rotated it regularly instead of just sliding it side to side." The historian glanced over, mildly interested but not enough to abandon his search of the walls. Old bakeries rearranged equipment for cleaning. Nothing unusual about that. Chloe crouched down anyway, running her hand along the base of the rack. There, near the back leg, she found a section of wood slightly smoother than the rest, polished by years of hands gripping the same spot. "Damien," she called, "come here." He crossed the room and together they gripped the rack and tried rotating it, mimicking the motion the scuff marks suggested. It resisted at first, heavy and stubborn, but after a firm push, it turned with a low creak, pivoting on some kind of hidden mechanism built into the base. Behind it, built into the wall the rack had been concealing, sat a narrow drawer, the kind a person might miss entirely unless they knew exactly where to look. Damien pulled it open. Inside was another journal, its cover worn thinner than the first, along with a stack of old receipts and handwritten ledgers. Chloe lifted the receipts carefully, scanning through them while Damien flipped through the journal. "These aren't ordinary receipts," Chloe said slowly. "They're property records, payments, deeds, names of buildings." She paused, tapping one line. "There's a property in Indianapolis here, and one in St. Louis." Damien looked over her shoulder, comparing the names against the notebook from the pantry. The handwriting matched, careful and deliberate, clearly written by the same man who'd left the earlier clues. "He didn't just hide one thing," Damien said. "He built an entire network. Properties, records, all of it connected." The historian, now genuinely curious, wandered over to look at the ledgers. "This is decades of documentation. Whatever your grandfather was protecting, he wasn't hiding it in one location. He spread it out on purpose." "So nobody could find it all at once," Chloe added. "Or steal it all at once." Damien nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to form a clearer picture in his mind. His grandfather hadn't buried treasure, he'd buried evidence, carefully distributed across cities and years, protected by a trail only someone patient and observant could follow. They spent another hour cataloging everything from the drawer, photographing pages of the journal in case anything happened to the originals. By the time they finished, the afternoon light outside had shifted, casting long shadows through the bakery's dusty front windows. As they packed up to leave, Chloe glanced toward the window and froze. A man stood across the street, half hidden behind a parked delivery van, a camera raised toward the bakery's entrance. He wasn't hiding particularly well, but he wasn't approaching either, simply watching, capturing photos of Damien's team as they exited the building. "Damien," she said quietly, nodding toward the window. Damien turned just in time to see the man lower the camera and walk briskly toward a car parked further down the block. By the time Damien reached the door, the vehicle was already pulling away, merging into traffic before he could catch more than a glimpse of the license plate. "Someone's definitely following us," Damien said, jaw tightening. Or they've been watching this bakery for longer than we have, Chloe suggested, waiting to see who eventually showed up. Damien considered that for a moment, unease settling deeper in his chest. Whoever it was hadn't approached, hadn't confronted them, hadn't tried to stop them from taking the journal or the receipts. They'd simply watched and left, which somehow felt more unsettling than if they'd tried something bold. "They're patient," Damien murmured, "which means they already know this is going to take time. They're not trying to beat us to the next clue. They're just making sure they know exactly where we're going." Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, glancing once more at the empty street where the car had disappeared. "Then we need to be more careful about who else knows our next move." Damien thought of Richard immediately, the photograph from the pantry surfacing in his mind, but he said nothing yet. Some suspicions needed proof before they could be spoken aloud. "Let's get back to Chicago," he said instead. "We have a lot to go through, and I think it's time I asked Richard a few careful questions." Chicago headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a building Damien's grandfather had bought decades earlier, back when the family's legitimate business interests were still small enough to fit in a single office. Now the floors buzzed with lawyers, accountants, and advisors, all of them running the parts of the empire that didn't require Damien's direct attention. Richard Collins had an office on the top floor, the largest one aside from Damien's own, a privilege earned through 30 years of loyal service. He was 61, silver-haired, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, even when he didn't. Damien had known him his entire life. Richard had taught him how to read a contract before he learned to drive. He'd stood beside Damien's grandfather at every major decision the family made, which was exactly why the photograph from the pantry unsettled Damien so deeply. He spread the documents from Milwaukee across the conference table that evening, Chloe seated across from him, both of them working through the ledgers page by page. The property records mentioned buildings in St. Louis and Indianapolis, but also referenced older transactions that didn't match anything in the family's current holdings. "These deals happened before you were born," Chloe said, tracing a finger along a faded entry. "Whatever your grandfather was protecting, it goes back further than I thought." Damien nodded, distracted. His mind kept circling back to Richard, to the photograph, to the easy familiarity the man had always shown around the family's private affairs. He didn't want to believe it. Richard had never given him a reason to doubt him, not once in 28 years. But the timing bothered him. 2 days ago, before the trip to Milwaukee, Richard had stopped by the estate unannounced, claiming he wanted to check on how Damien was settling in. He'd asked, almost casually, whether the cookbook mystery had turned up anything interesting. Damien hadn't thought much of it then. Now the question felt loaded. "He asked about the cookbook before we even told anyone what we found," Damien said slowly. Chloe looked up. "Richard?" "He came by the house, asked if the experts had made progress." Damien rubbed his jaw. "I didn't mention the compartment. I didn't mention any of it. But he asked like he already suspected something was there." "Maybe he was just curious," Chloe offered, though her tone lacked conviction. "He's known your family a long time. People get curious about mysteries, even ones that aren't theirs." "Maybe," Damien said, "but curiosity doesn't usually come with that many specific questions." He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Richard had earned decades of trust, and accusing him without proof would damage a relationship that mattered, both personally and professionally. Instead, Damien picked up his phone and called Frank. "I need you to quietly look into Richard's recent activity," Damien said once Frank answered. "Phone records, meetings, anything unusual over the last month. Don't approach him directly, just gather what you can." Frank agreed without asking many questions, the kind of loyalty Damien had come to rely on completely. After the call, Chloe returned to the cookbook, which she'd brought along from the estate, flipping slowly through its worn pages again, checking for anything the earlier search might have missed. She'd learned by now that Damien's grandfather rarely left anything to simple chance. If there was a first layer of clues hidden in the recipe order, there was a good chance more existed beneath the surface. She ran her fingers gently along the inside binding of one page, feeling for anything unusual. Most pages felt the same, slightly rough where age had dried the paper, slightly stiff along the spine. But near the back of the book, one page felt different, thicker, like something had been slipped inside the binding itself. "Damien," she said, holding the book toward the light, "come look at this." He crossed the room, and together they examined the spine where the pages met. Using a thin letter opener from the desk, Chloe carefully worked the binding loose, revealing a tiny, folded slip of paper tucked between the layers, written in the same careful handwriting as everything else. "If Richard finds this before you do, he will tell you it means nothing. Don't believe him. Look at the ledger from 1987. Compare the signatures." Damien read the note twice, a slow, uncomfortable chill settling over him. "He knew," Damien said quietly. "My grandfather knew Richard might find this eventually. He specifically warned about him." Chloe's expression tightened. "That doesn't necessarily mean Richard did anything wrong. It could mean your grandfather worried Richard might interfere, even with good intentions." "Or it means exactly what it sounds like," Damien said. He set the note down carefully, staring at it like it might reveal more if he looked long enough. 28 years of trusting Richard, and now a single sentence hidden inside a cookbook had planted a seed of doubt he couldn't easily uproot. They spent the next hour searching through the Milwaukee ledgers for any record from 1987, eventually finding a page near the back, a property transfer involving one of the buildings mentioned earlier. 2 signatures appeared at the bottom, one belonging to Damien's grandfather, the other belonging to a name Damien didn't recognize immediately. "Walter Reyes," Chloe read aloud. "Who's that?" Damien shook his head slowly. "I have no idea. He's not in any family records I've seen." "Maybe your grandfather's notebook mentions him," Chloe suggested, already flipping back through the earlier pages. She found nothing directly, but a small margin note near an unrelated entry caught her eye, written in tighter handwriting like it had been added later. "W.R. Handle carefully. R.C. knows more than he admits." Damien read the initials twice before it clicked. R.C. Richard Collins. The room felt heavier suddenly, the weight of decades-old secrets pressing down on both of them. Whatever had happened between his grandfather, Richard, and this unfamiliar man named Walter Reyes had clearly mattered enough to leave warnings scattered across multiple documents. Damien's phone buzzed again. Frank, sending an update far sooner than expected. Richard made 3 calls last week to a number registered under a company that dissolved years ago, also visited a storage facility outside the city Tuesday afternoon. No explanation on record. Damien stared at the message for a long moment before showing it to Chloe. "Tuesday afternoon," she said quietly. "The same day someone moved boxes in your basement." Damien set the phone down slowly, his jaw tightening. "I think it's time Richard and I had a longer conversation," he said. "But not yet. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with." The tiny note hidden inside the cookbook's binding held one more line neither Damien nor Chloe had noticed at first, tucked beneath the warning about Richard. A single address, faded but legible, pointing toward a railway station in St. Louis. They left early the next morning, choosing to drive rather than fly, both of them agreeing it was easier to stay quiet about their movements that way. Damien brought only Chloe this time, no consultants, no extra security beyond a single car trailing at a careful distance. Whoever had been watching them in Milwaukee hadn't confronted them directly, and Damien wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. The station itself had been decommissioned decades earlier, its grand entrance now serving as a small transportation museum,
most of the original building preserved out of historical interest rather than practical use.
An elderly curator greeted them at the door, more than happy to give a private tour once Damien mentioned his family name and a modest donation to the preservation fund. "Harrison," the curator repeated, studying Damien's face. "Your family used this station for shipping decades ago, didn't they? Freight, mostly, before the trucking industry took over." "That's what I understand," Damien said carefully. "I'm actually looking into some old family records. There might be a storage locker here somewhere, something my grandfather used." The curator's eyebrows rose with interest. "We still have the old luggage lockers, believe it or not. Never got around to removing them. Follow me." He led them through a hallway lined with black and white photographs, past display cases holding old train schedules and conductor uniforms, until they reached a quiet corner where a wall of brass lockers stood, numbered and untouched for what looked like half a century. Damien produced the antique brass key from the pantry, and the curator's eyes lit up with recognition. "That matches locker 17, he said, pointing toward a specific door near the bottom row. "We keep them locked, mostly for show now, but the mechanisms still work." Damien knelt down and slid the key into the lock. It turned with some resistance, decades of disuse fighting against the motion, but eventually the door creaked open. Inside sat a small leather case, dust-covered but intact. Damien pulled it out carefully while the curator, sensing the moment required privacy, excused himself to attend to other visitors. Chloe knelt beside Damien as he opened the case on a nearby bench. Inside were train schedules, dozens of them, along with shipping ledgers similar to the ones from Milwaukee, and a folded map showing several locations across the Midwest, each one marked with a small symbol Damien didn't immediately recognize. "These schedules go back to the 1970s, Chloe said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "Why would your grandfather keep decades of old train times?" Damien frowned, studying one of the schedules closely. Something about it seemed off, though he couldn't place what at first. He glanced toward the wall of old photographs they'd passed earlier, framed images of the station in its working years, clocks visible in several of the backgrounds. "Chloe," he said slowly, "look at the clocks in those photographs." She followed his gaze, then walked back toward the hallway to examine them more closely. 4 photographs, each showing a different section of the station, each with a large clock somewhere in the frame. She compared the times shown in each image, and a small frown crossed her face. "These don't match," she said. "If they were all taken around the same period, the clocks should show roughly similar times, accounting for different angles of the room, but they don't. Look, this one says 10:40, this one says 2:15. That's too big a gap for photographs taken during the same event." Damien joined her, studying each photograph carefully. She was right. The discrepancy felt intentional rather than accidental, the kind of detail someone might notice only if they were looking specifically for something out of place. "He wanted someone to notice this," Damien said, "the same way the cookbook recipes weren't randomly ordered." They returned to the schedules with fresh eyes, this time cross-referencing the specific times shown in each photograph against the train schedules from the leather case. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful comparison before Chloe found the connection. 10:40, she said, tapping one schedule. "There's a train listed at 10:40 here, heading toward Indianapolis. And this one," she added, pointing to the second photograph's time, "matches a return schedule from the same route." Damien looked at the shipping ledger again, running his finger down a list of addresses until he found one that matched a stop along that particular Indianapolis route, a warehouse, listed under a company name that no longer existed, located on the outskirts of the city. "That's it," Damien said. "That's where this is pointing." Chloe sat back slightly, exhaling. "Your grandfather built all of this using train schedules and mismatched photographs. 99 experts couldn't have figured this out without knowing exactly what to look for." "You figured it out in 20 minutes, Damien pointed out. "Because I know what it feels like when something's deliberately out of place," she said simply. "Cleaning houses teaches you that. People rearrange things without realizing it, But there's always a reason, even when they don't notice it themselves. Damien studied her for a moment, something warm settling behind the growing unease of the day. Whatever this trail eventually led to, he was grateful, genuinely grateful, that she'd been the one walking it beside him. They packed the leather case carefully and thanked the curator on their way out, promising to return with a more generous donation once things settled down. As they crossed the parking lot toward their car, Damien noticed another vehicle pulling in from the opposite direction, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd arrived precisely on schedule rather than by coincidence. Two men stepped out, glancing briefly toward Damien and Chloe, before walking directly into the station. "They're not here for the museum," Chloe murmured. "No," Damien agreed, watching the men disappear through the entrance. "They're here for exactly what we just found." He guided Chloe quickly toward the car, sliding into the driver's seat and pulling out of the lot before the men reappeared. Whoever was tracking their movements clearly had better information than Damien had assumed, close enough behind them now that minutes, not days, separated their discoveries. "Indianapolis," Damien said, gripping the wheel a little tighter than necessary. "We need to get there first." The warehouse sat at the edge of an industrial stretch outside Indianapolis, surrounded by chain-link fencing that had rusted through in places, the kind of building most people would drive past without a second glance. Damien parked a block away, choosing caution over convenience after the encounter at the railway station. "If those men know about this place too, they might already be here," Chloe said as they approached on foot. "Then we move fast," Damien replied, though the fence looked undisturbed, no fresh tire tracks in the gravel lot, no signs anyone had visited recently. The lock on the main entrance was old but sturdy, and it took Damien several minutes with tools from the car before it finally gave way. Inside, the warehouse stretched out in dim silence, dust hanging visible in the shafts of light coming through cracked skylights above. Rows of old furniture sat draped in cloth covers, and stacks of sealed wooden crates lined one entire wall, untouched for what looked like decades. Chloe walked slowly through the space, running her hand along the covered furniture, while Damien headed straight for the crates, prying one open with a crowbar he'd brought along for exactly this purpose. Inside was nothing but old office equipment, typewriters, ledgers long since gone to mold, filing supplies that had crumbled with age. He opened a second crate, then a third, each one revealing more of the same. No hidden compartments, no locked boxes, nothing that matched the significance the trail had built toward. "There's nothing here," Damien said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Just junk." Chloe didn't answer right away. She'd stopped near the far wall, studying a large steel shelving unit that stood slightly askew, its back edge pressed almost flush against the wall in a way that seemed unnecessarily tight for a room with this much open space. "Damien," she said, "come look at this." He crossed the room, and she pointed toward a section near the top of the shelving unit, where a ventilation grate should have been visible along the wall based on the pattern of similar grates elsewhere in the building. Here, the grate wasn't visible at all, blocked entirely by the shelf's positioning. "Every other vent in this place sits exposed," Chloe said. "Why would someone push a shelf directly in front of this one and leave it there for years?" Damien studied the gap between the shelf and the wall, then grabbed the edge and pulled. It resisted at first, heavier than it looked, but eventually slid several feet across the concrete floor with a low grinding sound. Behind it, instead of a simple ventilation shaft, sat a reinforced door, painted the same dull gray as the surrounding wall, blending in almost perfectly unless someone knew exactly where to look. "That's not a vent," Damien said quietly. The door wasn't locked, just stiff from disuse. Damien pushed it open, and a rush of noticeably cooler air greeted them, confirming what the design already suggested. A climate-controlled room, small but carefully maintained, hidden behind a wall meant to look like nothing more than warehouse storage. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, along with several bankers' boxes stacked neatly on shelving built specifically for the space. Everything here had been preserved deliberately,
kept safe from the temperature swings that had clearly damaged the crates outside. Damien opened the nearest cabinet, pulling out a thick folder labeled simply Property Holdings, 1985 to 1991. Inside were contracts, legal filings, and correspondence between his grandfather and several names Damien didn't recognize, alongside a few he did, including Richard Collins. Chloe worked through another cabinet nearby, pulling out journals similar to the ones they'd already found, along with photographs showing meetings between Damien's grandfather and a rotating cast of business associates over the years. "These aren't just business records," Chloe said, flipping through one journal slowly. "Listen to this." She read aloud a passage describing a series of transactions from decades earlier, where family assets had been quietly transferred between shell companies, the paper trail deliberately confusing, designed either to protect something or to hide it. Damien couldn't yet tell which. He kept reading, cabinet after cabinet, and slowly a clearer picture began forming. His grandfather hadn't spent his final years hiding money or valuables at all. He'd spent them documenting a betrayal, one that had happened decades earlier, gathering proof piece by piece and scattering it across cities so no single person could destroy the entire record at once. "He wasn't protecting wealth," Damien said slowly, sitting back against one of the cabinets. "He was protecting the truth about something somebody else did." Chloe looked up from the journal in her hands. "Something involving Richard?" "I don't know yet," Damien admitted. "But his name keeps appearing everywhere. Not always in a bad light, but often enough that it can't be coincidence." They spent the next 2 hours cataloging everything the hidden room contained, photographing pages, organizing folders by date, trying to build a timeline out of decades of scattered documentation. The deeper they went, the more it became clear that whatever had happened, it had shaped the entire trail Damien's grandfather built. Every clue, every hidden compartment, all of it designed around protecting this exact collection of evidence.
By the time they finished, evening light had faded to near darkness outside, and Damien realized they'd have to return the following day to finish transporting everything safely back to Chicago. As they locked the reinforced door and slid the shelving unit back into place, Chloe paused near the warehouse entrance, looking back at the space they were about to leave behind. "All of this," she said, "just to protect the family's reputation. Not money, not power, just the truth." Damien considered that for a long moment, thinking of the 99 experts who'd spent 2 weeks assuming there was a fortune waiting somewhere at the end of this trail. "My grandfather always said reputation outlasts money," Damien said quietly. "I don't think I ever understood what he meant until right now." They stepped out into the cooling evening air, locking the warehouse behind them, both aware the trail was far from finished. Whatever betrayal his grandfather had spent decades documenting still had one final piece missing, a name attached to the original wrongdoing that hadn't yet surfaced from any of the records they'd found. And somewhere close behind them, the people tracking their progress were undoubtedly still watching, waiting for the moment Damien finally uncovered the whole truth. Back at the estate, Damien spread every document across the long dining table, the same table where the cookbook had once sat, mocking 99 experts. Now, it held something far heavier. Contracts, journals, ledgers, photographs, all of it stretching back decades, waiting to be pieced together into something resembling the truth. Chloe worked beside him, sorting papers by date, while Damien cross-referenced signatures against the samples they'd already collected. It was tedious work, hours of comparing handwriting and matching names, but neither of them wanted to rush something this important. It was Chloe who noticed it first. "This signature," she said, holding up a contract from 1989. "Look at the way the letter R curves. I've seen this exact style somewhere recently." Damien leaned over, studying the loop at the top of the letter, the slight slant that carried through the rest of the name. He couldn't immediately place it, but Chloe's frown deepened as she thought harder. "Richard," she said suddenly. "I've seen him sign things at the estate.
His R curves the same way. I've watched him sign delivery forms 100 times. Damien pulled out several documents Richard had signed over the past year, comparing them side by side with the older contract. The similarity wasn't subtle once he looked properly. The same curve, the same pressure at the base of each letter, consistent across 3 decades. "He signed this," Damien said quietly, "under a different name." The contract bore the signature of someone called R. Coleman, a name Damien had never encountered anywhere else in the family's records. But the handwriting told a different story than the name did. Rather than confronting Richard immediately, Damien spent the next 2 days quietly verifying everything through his legal team, cross-checking the Coleman signature against notarized documents from the same period, tracing the shell company mentioned in the warehouse journals back through old filings until a clear pattern emerged. Richard had used the alias more than once, always in transactions involving the same handful of properties, always timed close to entries in Damien's grandfather's notebook. Once the paperwork confirmed what the handwriting suggested, Damien invited Richard to the estate for what he framed as a routine meeting, nothing more than a catching up between family and advisor. Richard arrived exactly on time, as he always did, dressed sharply, carrying the same easy confidence he'd shown Damien his entire life. They sat in the study, Chloe present at Damien's request, positioned quietly near the window, while Damien laid the documents across the desk between them. Richard's expression shifted the moment he saw the Coleman signature. "Where did you find this?" he said, his voice noticeably tighter than a moment before. "Milwaukee," Damien said. "Indianapolis. A few other places my grandfather thought worth protecting." He watched Richard carefully. "You want to explain the name?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, the confidence slowly draining from his posture. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the smooth assurance Damien had grown up hearing. "It was decades ago," Richard said, "before you were born. There were mistakes made, financial decisions that could have destroyed your grandfather's reputation if they'd come out publicly at the time. I helped him restructure the records under different names, spread the risk across several identities, so no single document could expose everything at once." "Mistakes," Damien repeated. "Whose mistakes?" Richard hesitated, and in that hesitation, Damien understood there was more to this than a simple confession. "Not mine," Richard said finally. "Not originally. Your grandfather trusted a man named Walter Reyes with several of the family's early ventures. Reyes made decisions that put everything at risk, moved money in ways that could have been called fraud if anyone official had looked closely enough. Your grandfather discovered it years later, long after Reyes had already left the business, but by then, exposing it would have meant exposing your grandfather's own negligence in trusting him." "So you covered it up," Chloe said quietly from her spot near the window. Richard looked at her, then back at Damien, something like shame crossing his face for the first time. "I helped bury it," Richard admitted. "Your grandfather asked me to, and I agreed, because I believed protecting the family mattered more than the truth coming out. I created the Coleman identity to handle the paperwork that needed restructuring. It was meant to be temporary, just long enough to stabilize things. But temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent when nobody wants to revisit them." Damien sat back, processing the weight of what Richard had just confirmed. Decades of quiet deception, not for personal gain, but out of a misguided sense of loyalty, protecting a mistake instead of correcting it. "You should have told me," Damien said. "Years ago, when I inherited all of this. You let me hire 99 experts to chase a mystery you already understood." "I didn't know your grandfather had built an entire trail around it," Richard said honestly. "I thought the past stayed buried. I didn't realize he'd spent his final years documenting everything so thoroughly, or that he'd leave clues specifically warning you about me." That admission landed heavier than anything else Richard had said. Damien's grandfather hadn't trusted Richard completely, not with this. He'd trusted him enough to keep him close, but not enough to let the secret die quietly with time. "Where's Reyes now?" Damien asked. "The man who actually caused this." "Dead," Richard said. "Years ago. Natural causes, nothing dramatic. He left the business behind and lived quietly until the end. Whatever anger you feel, there's no one left to direct it toward except me, and I understand if that's difficult to accept." Damien studied Richard for a long moment, weighing decades of loyalty against this singular, significant betrayal. Richard hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't profited from any of it. He'd simply chosen silence over honesty, believing it protected the people he cared about. "I need time," Damien said finally. "This changes things between us, Richard. I won't pretend it doesn't." Richard nodded slowly, accepting that without argument, and rose from his chair with none of the confidence he'd walked in with. "For what it's worth," Richard said quietly at the door, "your grandfather forgave me for this, eventually. I hope someday you might consider the same."
But I understand if that takes considerably longer than a single conversation. After he left, Chloe crossed the room and sat beside Damien, both of them staring at the scattered documents that had finally revealed the truth behind decades of careful secrecy. "One more piece," Damien said quietly. "The final archive. Whatever's left has to be waiting somewhere close to the end of this trail." The last clue had been sitting in the warehouse journals all along, easy to overlook amid pages of financial records and property transfers. Damien found it 2 days after Richard's confession, tucked into the margin of a ledger entry from 1991, a single line in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. "Everything that matters most sits where Thomas kept his grain. Springfield." He never asked for anything but honesty, and that's exactly what he'll get in return. Damien recognized the name immediately from the old photograph found in the pantry. Thomas Whitfield, the third man standing beside his grandfather and Anton Petrov, the one figure they still hadn't identified a location for. A quick search through old family correspondence turned up an address outside Springfield, Illinois, a farmhouse that had belonged to the Whitfield family for generations. They drove out early the next morning, the trail finally narrowing toward what felt like an ending rather than another beginning. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by open fields that stretched toward the horizon. Quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the industrial edges of Indianapolis or the empty city blocks of Milwaukee. An elderly woman answered the door when they knocked, introducing herself as Margaret, Thomas Whitfield's daughter, still living on the property her father had left behind. She studied Damien's face for a long moment before recognition settled in. "You look like your grandfather," she said. "Around the eyes, mostly. I always wondered if someone from your family would eventually come looking." "You knew we'd come?" Damien asked. "My father told me, years before he passed, said if a Harrison ever showed up asking about the grain storage, I was to let them in without question and not ask too many things myself." She smiled faintly. "He trusted your grandfather completely. Whatever this is about, I imagine it's important enough that I don't need to understand all of it." She led them through the farmhouse and out toward an old grain storage building set apart from the main house, weathered but clearly maintained over the years, despite no longer serving its original purpose. Inside, the space had been restored at some point, the dirt floor replaced with proper flooring, shelving installed along one wall like someone had converted it into a private study rather than leaving it as simple storage. "My father spent hours out here in his final years," Margaret said. "Always said he was organizing old records. I never asked what records exactly." Damien and Chloe stepped further inside while Margaret waited near the door, respecting whatever privacy the moment required. The shelving held rows of boxes, each labeled carefully in handwriting Damien now recognized instantly as his grandfather's. Not Thomas Whitfield's handwriting at all. His grandfather had been the one organizing this space, likely during visits Damien had never known about. "He built this specifically for the end of the trail," Chloe said quietly, running her fingers along the box labels. "Everything led here on purpose." They opened the boxes one by one,
and inside sat the true weight of everything the trail had promised. Original journals detailing the entire Reyes situation from the very beginning, long before Richard's involvement, showing exactly how the fraud had occurred and precisely how much Damien's grandfather had lost trying to protect the family from public exposure at the time.
Signed agreements between Thomas Whitfield, Anton Petrov, and Damien's grandfather, three friends who had each agreed to hold pieces of the truth separately so no single betrayal could erase the entire record. Photographs filled another box, decades of gatherings between the three families, proof of a friendship that had outlasted business complications, personal tragedies, and the kind of secrets most people would have let destroy them entirely. And near the bottom of the final box, a stack of personal letters, written not for legal purposes, but simply between old friends, discussing fears, regrets, and the quiet hope that someday the full truth might surface without damaging anyone who didn't deserve the fallout. Damien read through several of the letters, feeling the weight of his grandfather's voice in a way the earlier notebooks hadn't fully captured. This wasn't a man protecting wealth or power. This was a man trying desperately to protect the people he loved from a mistake made decades earlier, one that had never been entirely his own to carry. He never wanted revenge, Damien said quietly, sitting back against the shelving. He just wanted the truth preserved somewhere safe, waiting for someone patient enough to find it properly. Chloe sat beside him, flipping through one of the journals herself. Every clue fits now. The cookbook, the bakery, the railway station, the warehouse. None of it was random. He built this entire trail so carefully that only someone who truly paid attention could follow it to the end. 99 experts, Damien said, almost laughing despite everything. All of them looking for complicated codes and hidden meanings, and it just needed someone who noticed the small things nobody else bothered to look at twice. Chloe smiled at that, setting the journal down gently. Your grandfather understood people better than any of those experts understood puzzles. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully packing everything for the trip back to Chicago, Margaret bringing them coffee and sitting with them for a while, sharing stories about her father and the friendship he'd maintained with the Harrisons for most of his life. She seemed relieved, in a quiet way, that the boxes her father had guarded so carefully had finally found their way to someone who understood their importance. Before they left, Margaret handed Damien one final envelope, sealed and marked only with his name. He left this separately, she said, told me to give it directly to whoever eventually came looking, not to include it with the rest. Damien opened it carefully once they were back in the car. Inside was a short letter from his grandfather, dated just months before his passing. If you've made it this far, you've proven something more valuable than any fortune I could have left you. You've proven you know how to look closely, trust carefully, and follow the truth even when it's scattered and difficult. Whoever helped you find this, treasure them. Not everyone possesses the patience this trail required. I certainly didn't, not until I grew old enough to understand its value. Damien folded the letter slowly, glancing toward Chloe as she watched the fields pass by outside the window, unaware of exactly what the letter said, but clearly sensing the moment carried weight. We're finished, Damien said quietly. Everything he wanted protected. We found all of it. Chloe turned to him, a soft, tired smile crossing her face. Then I suppose it's time to go home. The dining room at Harrison Estate hadn't held this many people in years. Damien had gathered his senior team, along with a few of the family's oldest associates, everyone standing quietly around the long table where the cookbook had once sat, mocking 99 experts who couldn't solve what a housekeeper managed in 60 seconds. The boxes from Springfield sat arranged carefully at one end of the table, alongside everything collected from Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Indianapolis. Weeks of searching, decades of careful concealment, all of it finally assembled in one room for everyone to see. Damien stood at the head of the table, Chloe positioned nearby, though she'd tried to stay toward the back of the room, clearly uncomfortable with the attention gathering around her. Damien had insisted she stay close. After everything, he wasn't about to let her disappear quietly into the background the way she usually preferred.
3 months ago, Damien began, addressing the room. I inherited more than an estate. I inherited a mystery my grandfather spent the final years of his life protecting. One so carefully hidden that 99 specialists couldn't make sense of it despite weeks of trying. He gestured toward the assembled documents. What we found wasn't wealth. It wasn't power. It was the truth about a mistake made decades ago, one my grandfather chose to protect rather than expose, out of loyalty to people he cared about. That decision cost him years of quiet worry, and it nearly cost several of you your reputations, unfairly, because suspicion has a way of spreading even when the real story stays buried. Several people in the room exchanged glances, some visibly relieved, others clearly aware for the first time just how close their own names had come to being tangled in accusations they'd never deserved. Damien had already spent the previous evening speaking privately with a few of them, clearing up decades-old assumptions that had quietly followed certain associates without their knowledge. The documents here confirm everything, Damien continued. Walter Reyes caused the original financial mismanagement, decades before most of us were born. Richard Collins helped conceal it, believing at the time he was protecting the family rather than deceiving it. Whatever judgment any of you choose to make about that decision, the historical record is now clear, verified, and permanently preserved as part of this family's legacy. He paused, glancing briefly toward Richard, who stood near the far wall, quiet and visibly humbled since their conversation days earlier. Damien hadn't fully forgiven him yet, not completely, but he'd stopped viewing him as an enemy. Decades of loyalty deserved more nuance than a single moment of poor judgment could erase entirely. None of this would have been found, Damien said, turning finally toward Chloe, without someone who understood this house and this family better than anyone I hired to look for it. The room's attention shifted toward her, and Chloe visibly stiffened, clearly wishing she could melt into the wallpaper. Chloe Brooks solved in 1 minute what 99 experts couldn't solve in 2 weeks, Damien said. Not because she had special training in codes or ciphers, but because she paid attention. She noticed details the rest of us walked past every single day without seeing them properly. Every clue after that first one, she found because she trusted her instincts instead of overcomplicating things the way the rest of us naturally did. He turned fully to face her now, ignoring the murmurs spreading quietly through the room. My grandfather built this entire trail, believing someone patient enough would eventually walk it. I don't think he ever imagined it would be the woman who dusted his kitchen shelves every morning. But looking back at everything now, I think he would have been thrilled it turned out this way. Chloe's cheeks flushed, though she managed a small, genuine smile despite the attention. I just did what I always do, she said quietly. I paid attention to the house. It's not really more complicated than that. It clearly is, Damien said, echoing words he'd said to her weeks earlier in the pantry. Since 99 people missed it entirely. A quiet laugh moved through the room, easing some of the tension that had built over the past hour. Once the meeting concluded and most of the associates had filed out, Damien remained in the dining room with Chloe, the two of them beginning the slow work of properly organizing everything into the estate's permanent archive. He'd already decided the cookbook, the journals, and every document collected along the trail would be preserved exactly where his grandfather would have wanted them kept, protected as carefully as the truth itself had been protected. What happens with Richard now? Chloe asked as they worked. Damien considered the question for a long moment. He stays, he said finally. Not in the same role, not with the same access he's had for 30 years, but he stays. My grandfather forgave him eventually, according to what Richard told me. I think, given enough time, I might manage the same. Chloe nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer, though she didn't push further. They worked in comfortable silence for a while longer, sorting the final boxes, until Damien finally sat back, studying the collection they'd assembled. Weeks ago, he'd walked into this estate expecting nothing more than paperwork and lawyers. He hadn't expected a mystery. He certainly hadn't expected the person who solved it to become someone he now couldn't imagine simply working around the house without noticing entirely. "I have a proposal," Damien said, glancing toward her. "Not about the estate, about you." Chloe raised an eyebrow, clearly bracing for something businesslike. "I want you working directly with me from now on," Damien said. "Not cleaning shelves, managing the family archive, consulting on anything requiring exactly the kind of attention you've shown this entire trail. Whatever title makes sense, whatever salary you think is fair, you've more than earned it." Chloe studied him for a long moment, surprise slowly shifting into something warmer. "You're serious?" "Completely," Damien said. 99 experts couldn't do what you did in one afternoon. I'd be a fool to let that kind of instinct go back to dusting kitchen counters." She laughed softly, glancing around the dining room one final time, at the cookbook sitting quietly at the center of the table where everything had begun. "All right," she said. "I accept. But I'm still dusting the kitchen shelves occasionally. Old habits." Damien smiled, something settling easily in his chest for the first time in weeks. Whatever his grandfather had truly hoped for when he built this trail, patience rewarded, trust earned carefully, truth eventually surfacing exactly when it needed to, Damien understood now that the greatest inheritance he'd received wasn't hidden in any compartment, drawer, or archive. It had been standing quietly beside him the entire time, paying attention to details nobody else thought to notice.